What better signal of resolve could we send than strengthening our missile defenses in NATO? The steps announced so far in response to Russia's approaching annexation of Crimea have been met with derision. Further missile defense deployments would be an even more effective way, I would argue, to demonstrate that there are real consequences for aggression, and this is something that Moscow really cares about. As for Russia, it's increased its reliance on nuclear weapons and is undertaking a large-scale modernization of its offensive nuclear forces. Under New START, the United States is committed to substantial reductions while Russia expands its launchers and warheads, ICBMs, SLBMs, and bombers. Disturbingly, multiple Russian sources have described tests of a new ground-launched cruise missile going back to as far as 2008. That would be a clear violation of the 1987 INF Treaty. How firmly the Obama administration has raised the compliance issue is a matter for conjecture, but the response is not. Moscow has stonewalled without any consequences whatsoever. With an eye toward China, Russian leaders have for years talked about the unfairness of the INF Treaty, which restricts the United States and Russia, while others are free to deploy intermediate-range ground-launch cruise and ballistic missiles. As President Putin swallows the Crimea and postures to use force under the pretense of protecting ethnic Russians within the boundaries of the former Soviet Union, the potential strategic significance of such missiles becomes more evident. I think we've come a long way in our thinking about Russia over the course of the last several weeks. In December, I visited a major European command, and I remember a discussion in which I raised the possibility, not the expectation, but the possibility of Russia using force if things went the wrong way in Ukraine. My colleagues rejected that notion out of hand, saying that Moscow would not risk the economic and other equities that it has in sustaining peaceful relations with the West. Fast forward 3 months, and the question today is how far Putin will go and how much force he is willing to use. I tend to think that Putin himself doesn't know the answers to these questions yet. Perhaps a better question is how can we influence the decision-making calculus of the Russian leader? If I had time, I would go on with China, Syria, Pakistan, and others, but let me just say that I find it very difficult to reconcile what we are observing with the view that we have entered a new era of interstate relations, that is, with the dawning of the 21st century and the growing interdependence, diplomacy and engagement have replaced intimidation and the use of force. This worldview recognizes that not all leaders act consistent with international law and international norms, but it characterizes these leaders, the leaders of errant states, as aberrations, as being on the wrong side of history, or as acting out of weakness. The hope is that they will come to see their interests as we see their interests, but hope cannot substitute for strategy, and hope cannot provide a solid foundation for defending against real-world threats. Whether you agree or not with any particular rendition of history, there are 3 constants in fashioning effective responses to threats. One is the need for a comprehensive strategy that integrates all tools of statecraft. Another is the need to be perceived as acting with resolve. And a third is the need to maintain effective capabilities. And given the focus of this symposium, what I will do is address one subset of capabilities, and that is missile defenses, from both a regional and strategic perspective. I would just note that missile threats to NATO are becoming much more real and not just from Iran. Moscow has more than once threatened the basing countries with Iskander missiles, and the likely finding of the INF Treaty violation means that the alliance needs to consider its response. But I want to move on to a more strategic level, and in my view, 3 factors are most pertinent to the topic of the day. 1, Putin seeks to restore Russia's dominance in what Moscow calls the near abroad. In Putin's view, this is Russia's sphere of influence, and he is willing to use force to advance his goals. After Crimea, I think this point is generally accepted. 2, Putin sees the West as weak and as leaderless. Perhaps this was a consequence of the failure to respond in any meaningful way to the invasion and dismemberment of Georgia and the failed reset initiative which wiped the slate clean. Or perhaps it was the abandonment of the original third site without any real consultations with allies. Or perhaps it was the complete withdrawal from Iraq, placing in jeopardy the achievements of years of combat, lost lives, and hundreds of billions of dollars. Or perhaps it was the failure to use force after Assad crossed a bright, very bright red line. Or perhaps it is the steep decline in U.S. defense spending with a projected cut of 25% in the out years as adversaries increase their spending significantly. Pick 1, pick 2, pick 3, pick 4. I think you get the point. 3, Russia views the use of nuclear weapons much differently than we do. I will give you just one war story. In October of 2008, I visited Moscow to give a speech on U.S.-Russian relations post-Georgia. After the speech, 2 gentlemen took me aside. One was in a colonel's uniform. He was head of the USA office in the MOD. And the other was a retired intelligence officer, general officer. And they said to me that, they asked me, they said, did you realize that in the context of Georgia, Russia was planning and preparing for a nuclear exchange with the United States? Once I picked my mouth up from the floor, I said, no, I didn't realize that. When I went back to the States, I talked to the U.S. ambassador, who I had worked with over the course of a number of years, and asked him about this. He said, yes, it's exactly right. You sent a cruiser into the Black Sea. We didn't know what was on the cruiser. We had to be prepared. We had to be prepared. I still knew people in the higher levels of the U.S. government, and I asked many of them. I said, were we tracking this? Were we thinking about this? And I can tell you that I'm confident, at least, that of the hundreds, if not thousands, of analysts who were following Georgia at the time, not one was thinking about the use of nuclear weapons in that context. It just shows you how far apart our thinking is in the context of nuclear weapons. But given these factors, would a light system, such as that recommended by Senator Nunn in the 1990s for protection against accidental or unauthorized launch, be provocative? Or would it be prudent, perhaps even stabilizing, given Russia's reliance on nuclear weapons in its doctrine and declaratory policy? Now, Moscow would certainly object, but Moscow's objections alone doesn't make it destabilizing. At the theater level, with the emergence of the new face of Russia, the alliance must also think through the missile defense rationale and requirements to counter Moscow's missile threats against the basing states and the need for defenses against cruise missiles to respond to the likely INF violation. As for policy, what better signal of resolve could we send than strengthening our missile defenses in NATO? The steps announced so far in response to Russia's approaching annexation of Crimea have been met with derision. And even robust economic sanctions, if we were to put them into effect, would not likely be sufficient, as economic sanctions can cut in many different ways. Further missile defense deployments would be an even more effective way, I would argue, to demonstrate that there are real consequences for aggression, and this is something that Moscow really cares about. As for Ukraine, how can the U.S. and U.K. meet their security commitments made in the context of Kiev abandoning its nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union? There's no easy answer to the question, and missile defenses certainly are not a silver bullet, but cooperation in this area may play an important role. Ukraine's skilled engineers and defense industry may be real value added for us as well. To deal with the Putin challenge, we need both short-term responses and a longer-term strategy. We cannot succeed if we treat each successive crisis as a pickup game, and we need to accept that diplomacy, as important as it is not a substitute for military preparedness.